Good evening, students. Hello, Shubranil. I hope you're doing well. All right. So, in our previous lecture, we had talked about certain aspects of the Vedic age. We had seen the debate regarding the origin of the Aryans. We had talked about how and where they came from. We had talked about the uh, interaction that these people had with the local cultures. And next we need to talk about the geographical footprint of early Aryans. That means what was their core habitation zone, right? According to the Rig Veda, what was their homeland in India? The Sapt Sindhava. They referred to this region as Aryavarta, that is the land of the Aryans. And this is regarded as their core habitation zone, right? Now, the meaning of the word Saptasindhava, what does it mean? The seven indices, right? So, this refers to the land drained by seven different rivers. Kaun si? The Indus and its five southern tributaries. Kaun si? Jhelum, Chenab, Ravi, Beas, and सतलज. कितने हुए टोटल? 6. यहाँ पे कितने हैं? 7. This region also included the land drained by the river Ghaggar, right? Now these are the modern names of these rivers. Vedic texts refer to them by their Vedic names. Indus was Sindhu. Jhelum was Vitasta. Chenab was Askini. Ravi was Parushani. Beas was Vipasa. The Satluj was Sutudri, and the Ghaggar was the Saraswati River, right? Now, it is on the basis of such geographical references that we can get to know about the important geographical features that the early Aryans came into constant contact with. The frequency with which these geographical features, such as rivers, are mentioned also indicates their relative significance. On the basis of the numerical analysis of the number of times the names of these rivers are mentioned, सबसे important river कौन सा emerge होकर के आता है? The Indus. It is mentioned a total of 75 times. Another very important river of similar or even greater importance was the Saraswati River, which is mentioned 72 times. But it was considered by the Aryans to be of special religious significance. They called it Naditama, or the Mother River. Okay? Apart from this, other geographical features are also mentioned. such as the western tributaries of the Indus. किस तरह के रिवर्स मेंशन्ड है यहाँ पर? द काबुल, द स्वात रिवर, द गोमल रिवर. Kabul river was known as the Kubha river. Swat was known as the Suvastu river. Gomal was known as the Gomti river in the Rig Veda. Apart from that, we have references to certain other rivers in the northern plains, such as the Ganga and the Yamuna. The Yamuna is mentioned only 3 times, while the Ganga is mentioned even less, only 2 times. Similarly, in comparison to the rivers of the Sapt Sindhav, the western tributaries of the Indus are also mentioned quite infrequently, 3 or 4 times at the most. So, do the lands drained by these rivers constitute the core habitation zone or the peripheral habitation zone, frontier areas? Peripheral habitation zones. So, the lands drained by these rivers constitute the frontier regions of the early Vedic Aryans. Okay. Then apart from this, we also have references to other geographical features such as the Himavant Mountains. This was the Vedic name for the Western Himalayas. We also have reference to the Marduvridh river and the Mujvant peak. They are believed to be references to Kashmir. In fact, the Mujvant peak is often mentioned in the 9th mandala of the Rig Veda. The 9th mandala of the Rig Veda is dedicated to Soma. Soma was the god of drink. This drink was supposed to have magical properties. And what was the source of the Soma drink? The Soma plant. And what was the source of the Soma plant? This Mujvant peak. Okay? Now, is the 9th mandala of the Rig Veda one of the older portions of the Rig Veda or one of the younger portions of the Rig Veda? Younger portion है, right? First 8th 9th 10th ये later editions consider किए जाते हैं. That means it is only towards the end of the early Vedic age that people had come into contact with, or people had the Vedic Aryans had accessed the Mujvant peak and Kashmir. तो ये core habitation zone रहा होगा या फिर यहाँ पे बाद में पहुंचे लोग? बाद में पहुंचे. So for the early Aryans, this must have been a frontier area, right? Then we also have mention of the Dhanav. This is a Sanskrit word which means desert. Which desert do you think they were referring to? The Thar desert. What was the chief occupation of the early Aryans? They were nomadic pastoralists. Do you think that desert में बहुत major population concentration रहा होगा? No. So they must have come right up to the edge of the desert, rarely venturing into it. Right. So once again, this was a frontier area for them. Clear hai? So these are all frontier areas. Right. Then we also have certain archaeological remains belonging to cultures such as the PGW culture, the Symmetry H culture, and the Gandhar grave culture. What are the archaeological remains? We have pottery, we have bronze and copper tools and weapons. We have mud huts, and we have burials. Where are they located? Where is the concentration of PGW sites primarily in? Eastern Punjab and Haryana. In sites such as Nagar, Dadheri, Katpalon, etc., Bhagwanpura, etc. Cemetery H culture in Western Punjab. The most prominent site being Harappa, and the Gandhar grave culture in Northern Punjab, on the outskirts of cities such as Peshawar and Takshila. Okay? So these were the core habitational zones of the early Aryans. The archaeological remains correspond with the literary evidence. सप्त सिंधु वाले रीजन में वो आर्कियोलॉजिकल रिमेन भी सबसे ज्यादा मिलते हैं और ये मेंशन भी सबसे ज्यादा इन्हीं का है. क्लियर है इतना? डू आई नीड टू डिक्टेट दिस और शैल वी मूव ऑन? डिक्टेट कर दें? लिखो. The Aryans began arriving in the northwestern portion of the subcontinent via the mountain passes of the subcontinent, via the mountain passes separating modern Afghanistan and Pakistan. Modern Afghanistan and Pakistan. Full stop. Next point. They settled in the fertile region of the Indus Saraswati zone with Punjab and Haryana emerging as the core regions, of their culture, Full stop. Next point. This is corroborated by both literary and archaeological references. Full stop. Next point. The Rig Veda refers to the region of Sapt Sindhav, as Aryavarta. Full stop. It was the land drained by the following rivers. And then these 7 rivers, modern names and old names you can write down. Indus, Jhelum, Chenab, Ravi, Beas, Satluj, Sindhu, Vitasta, Askini, Parushini, Bipasa, Sotudri and Saraswati. Of these, the Indus, within brackets, mentioned 75 times, appears to be the most important. While the Saraswati, within brackets, mentioned 72 times, was the sacred river, called Naditama, within brackets, mother river. Full stop. Next point. The western tributaries of the Indus including the Kabul, within brackets, Kubha, Swat, within brackets, Suvastu, and Gomal, within brackets, Gomati, along with the Ganga and Yamuna, are mentioned very rarely. Indicating that the lands drained by these rivers formed the frontier regions of the early Aryans. Full stop. Next point. The Rig Veda also refers to Himavant within brackets, assumed to be the Western Himalayas. Assumed to be the Western Himalayas, comma, Kashmir within brackets, drained by the Marduvrid River. Kashmir within brackets, drained by the Marduvrid River and home of Marduvrid River, drained by the Marduvrid River and home of the Mujavant Peak. From which the Soma plant was obtained. Close brackets. And the Thar Desert. Within brackets, Dhanav. Close brackets. However, these were also frontier regions. Full stop. Next point. The Aryans also mentioned the presence of two major seas on India's western and eastern coasts. But it is unlikely that early Aryans were physically aware of them. That means it may have been a figment of their imagination that India was surrounded by two seas on the two sides, or they must have heard it from other local cultures who may have been trading with communities living closer to the coasts. Okay? So that is what we can say. Next main point likho. Archaeological evidence in the form of remains of the PGW culture, Gandhar grave culture, and the cemetery edge culture confirms that Punjab and Haryana constituted the nucleus of early Vedic habitation. Full stop. Some important sites include some important sites include Nagar, Katpalon, Harappa, Dadhiri, and Bhagwanpura. Nagar and Katpalon in Haryana, Harappa in Western Punjab or Pakistan, and Dadhiri and Bhagwanpura in Eastern Punjab or Indian Punjab. सॉरी, उल्टा हो गया, ये हरियाणा में, ये पंजाब में, ठीक है. Nagar and Katpalon in Punjab, Harappa in Western Punjab, and Nadiri and Bhagwanpura in Haryana. Okay. And if there is a question like this, then you can also show on the map. बट इनका कोर हैबिटेशन जोन जो है वो ये वाला है, and on their peripheries in the north, to the east and south were the peripheral areas. ये हो गए फ्रंटियर जोन्स, और ये वाला एरिया हो गया कोर जोन. And then during the later Vedic age, along the foothills of the Himalayas, they would migrate towards the east. Clear hai? This was their geographical footprint. Now, talking about their interaction with the natives. What do we find? Appearance में क्या लगता है? What was the nature of their interaction? It was entirely hostile. ठीक है? It was characterized by conflict. It used to be extremely hostile, characterized by frequent conflict. Do we have any evidence for this? The Rig Veda mentions a major war between them, that is the Das Rajan Yudh. Indra, who was not only the god of rain and thunder but also the god of war, was the most important deity, and he is credited for defeating the Dasas, Dasyus and Panis, right? Dasas, Dasyus and Panis कौन थे? They were non-Aryan groups who were fighting against Aryans, right? हाँ हाँ, पनीज, पनी वॉज ऑल्सो अनदर नेम फॉर दस्यूज, ठीक है? तो जो लोकल नेटिव्स थे, दैट मीन्स द नॉन आर्यन नेटिव्स, दे वर नोन एज द पनीज ऑल्सो. In fact, the very terms dasas, dasyus and panis किस तरह के terms हैं? Are they terms of adoration or terms of derision? They are terms of derision. These are derogatory terms. These groups constituted which portion of the population? The enslaved people, or people who were considered fit for enslavement. ठीक है? Then the Rig Ved also mentions a number of negative stereotypes about these groups. For example, dasas are described as untrustworthy. Dasyus are described as cattle thieves. And thus, the Rig Ved even justifies the act of Dasyu Hatya, that is, killing of the Dasyus. The Panis, that was a synonym of Dasyus, are also described as cattle thieves. And hoarders of wealth. The composers of the Rig Ved often warned the Aryans about the tricky nature of the Panis, that they are untrustworthy, right? So, this kind of negative stereotype indicates an element of deliberate otherization of a group of people. What was the basis of this otherization? Cultural differences and racial differences. The later Aryans who arrived had fairer skin color, while the early Aryans and the other natives had darker skin complexion. So that was the basis of differentiation. And further, both the early Aryans as well as the natives had a culture which was remarkably different from the late arrivals, right? On the basis of this kind of evidence, it has been suggested that the relationship between the natives and the Aryans was characterized by constant and frequent conflict. Conflict for what? Control of resources. What was the most important economic resource at that point of time? Cattle. So this was a form of tribal warfare for cattle. ठीक है? However, upon closer observation, a completely different picture, a more complex picture emerges. What do we find? That the relationship between the Aryans and the natives was characterized by a combination of conflict and cooperation. ठीक है, ये कोऑपरेशन हमें कहां पे दिखता है? इन दी archaeological remains at the PGW sites of Nagar, Katpalon, Dadheri, and Bhagwanpura. What do we find? The simultaneous settlement of this site by people of both Aryan as well as Chalcolithic origin. Okay? Then, in the Das Rajan Yudh, what do we find? That on one side was an Aryan tribe known as the Bharat tribe. On the other, there was a confederacy of 10 different tribes, out of which 5 were Aryan and 5 were non-Aryan. Okay? So this is another example of the cooperation between these two sides, right? Then the emergence of a new social group known as Dasas. Who were they? They were the descendants of early arriving Aryans and the local Chalcolithic or late Harappan people that were inhabiting the Indus Saraswati river systems. Okay? Now, they had intermixed with each other. There was genetic intermixing. That means there was intermarriage among these groups as well, right? So the very presence of this group indicates that their relationship was not confined only to conflict, but also involved elements of cooperation. Then we also find that the Aryans even traded with the local people, right? So Panis, while they have been derided, while they have been criticized for thieving cattle, for stealing cattle, they are also described as traders who traded with the Aryan pastoral nomadic tribes on a barter system basis. Okay? In fact, आप एक इस तरह का सिनेरियो इमेजिन कर सकते हैं that these Chalcolithic cultures represented primarily agrarian communities surrounded by the open wilds, right? This was the zone in which the surrounding tribes of Aryans would have roamed in search of green pastures throughout the year. They would come into contact with the Chalcolithic people on a seasonal basis, and the two communities would exchange goods. Sometimes conflicts would emerge, but on other times cooperation would be the norm. ठीक है, so इस तरह से आप इसको इमेजिन कर सकते हो. Further, the Aryans also began adopting certain practices or traits from the natives, such as their religious customs, their language, and their economic practices. Religious customs such as fire worship, language indicated by the adoption of retroflex sounds, and economic practices such as the beginning of agriculture. ठीक है, but this is not to say that the relationship was based on full-fledged cooperation. Conflict continued to remain a major element of the relationship between the local communities and the Aryans. And ये जो अदराइजेशन होता था, this was not limited to only racial grounds or economic grounds. This was also done on religious grounds. For example, the Aryans worshipped the cow, whereas the later Harappans as well as the Chalcolithic people worshipped the bull, right? Aryans hated the culture of fertility worship. They hated phallus worship. But जो Chalcolithic people थे, they worshipped fertility symbols such as the yoni, linga, etc. Right? So on the basis of this, एक complex picture emerge होती है. Yes, there was conflict, but there was also cooperation. Binary answer नहीं है, मतलब either or वाला answer नहीं है, complex picture है. ठीक है, composite picture बनेगा. Write down. Give the heading. Interaction of early Aryans with the natives. Interaction of early Aryans with the natives. लिखो. On the surface, it appears that the relationship between early Aryans and the Chalcolithic natives was extremely hostile. Full stop. एक सब point लिखो. The Rigved talks about the 10 Rajan Yudh, in which Sudas he was the king of the Bharat tribe. Sudas, the king of the Bharat tribe was assisted by Indra in defeating non-Aryans such as Dasas, Dasyus, and Panis. and Panis. Who were enslaved or considered fit for enslavement. Or considered fit for enslavement. Next point. Subpoint. Next subpoint. The element of conflict. The element of conflict is also tangible through the distinct undercurrent of otherizing these groups through negative stereotypes. इसके नीचे एग्जाम्पल्स करके लिखो. Example. Dasas were considered corrupt and untrustworthy. Example number 2. Dasyus were branded as cattle thieves. On the basis of which Dasyu Hatya was justified. Third example, Panis were also described as cattle thieves and hoarders of wealth. Full stop. Next subpoint. Examples खत्म हो गए. The Rig Veda also consists of references to battles waged between Aryans and non-Aryans for control of cattle resources. ठीक है. अगला मेन पॉइंट लिखो. However, comma, upon closer observation, a more complex picture emerges. Full stop. Subpoint. This relationship was characterized by elements of both conflict as well as cooperation. Full stop. Next main point. Archaeological remains from Nagar, Katpalon, Dadheri, and Bhagwanpura reveal cohabitation by Aryans and natives. By Aryans and natives. Next point. In the Das Rajan Yudh, comma, one of the sides was a confederacy of five Aryan and five non-Aryan tribes. 5 Aryan and 5 non-Aryan tribes. Okay. Next point. The emergence of the Sioux is evidence of genetic intermixing between Dasas is evidence of genetic intermixing between Aryans and non-Aryans. The emergence of the Dasa group, not the Sioux. ठीक है, तो उसको करेक्ट कर लेना. The emergence of the Dasas is evidence of genetic intermixing between Aryans and non-Aryans. Full stop. Next point. The Panis have been described by the Rig Veda as traders who exchanged goods such as food grains, copper objects, ornaments, and animal skins and wool with Aryans. Animal skins and wool with Aryans. ठीक है. Next point. The Aryans also adopted certain traits and practices from the natives, such as ABCA, religious practices, hyphen, fire worship, B, language, hyphen, retroflex sounds, and C, economic practices, hyphen, agriculture. ठीक है. Now conclusion लिख लो. This analysis reveals that while conflict was a major element of the relationship between Aryans and non-Aryans, they also cooperated with each other in several fields to a significant degree. In several fields to a significant degree. Okay. ये हो गया the nature of the relationship between the Aryans and early Aryans and the natives inhabiting the northwestern portion of the subcontinent. Next, we need to talk about the characteristics of life during the early Vedic age. Which aspects of the early Vedic life are we going to explore? Their, let's say, economic life, their political life, their social life, and their religious life. Right? One by one, we are going to talk about the important characteristics of these aspects of the early Vedic life. सबसे पहला economic life of the Aryans. What was the chief occupation of early Vedic Aryans? Pastoralism or animal husbandry. Which animals did they domesticate? Primarily cattle. Apart from that, horse, dog, different birds, goats, sheep, etc. also they used to keep. But cattle was the chief source of wealth. What was the Sanskrit word that the Aryans used to describe cattle? Gau. And the importance of cattle in the economic life of the Aryans can also be estimated from the kind and number of words that Gau forms the root word for. For example, from Gau comes Gopat. From Gau comes Gaudhuli. From Gau comes Gavyuti. From Gau comes Gavishti. From Gau comes Goghana. From a derivative of cattle comes the word Duhitri. Right? Duhitri means daughter. Right? Now, the word Duhitri comes from the root word Dugdh. Dugdh means milk. And Duhitri का literal meaning क्या होता है? The one who is responsible for drawing milk from the cow, for milking the cow. So that was the responsibility of young girls. Young girls were the daughters. So the word Duhitri was used to denote daughters, right? Gopat, pat comes from the word pati, meaning the lord or husband, right? तो अभी जो रईस आदमी होता है उसको क्या बोलते हैं? अरबपति, खरबपति, करोड़पति, उस समय गोपति. Why? Because cattle was the chief source of wealth. This was a rich man. गौधूली पता होगा क्या होता है? गौधूली बेला, the time of dusk. Why was it called Gaudhuli? Because at the time when the sun was setting, all the cattle would return to the settlement, return to their enclosures, thus kicking up a cloud of dust. So the time of the day where the sky is filled with dust, that is Gaudhuli Bela, right? That is dusk. Gavyuti was a unit of measuring length, right? और measuring distance. So कैसे measure करते थे? The length of an ordinary cow from nose to tail, जितना वो होगा उसके हिसाब से लेंथ को मेजर करते थे. अभी मीटर्स, फीट, इंचेस, सेंटीमीटर्स ये सब यूज होता है. उस समय गव्युति यूज होता था. गविष्टि was the word used for war. War for what? For cows. It also meant search or struggle. Struggle for what? Cows. Goghana was the term that was used for a respected guest. ये term थोड़ा controversial है. Some historians claim that this was used for people who ate cow meat, right? So it was only the respected guests who were offered the meat of cows, since cows were such an important economic resource. However, there are other historians who argue that the cow has always had very important religious significance for the Aryans and was never slaughtered by them for meat purposes, right? And therefore Goghana refers to those people who were offered ghee, that is a milk product, clarified butter जिसको बोलते हैं, right? And Goghana means the eater of ghee rather than the eater of cow meat, right? So pastoralism was the most important source of income or most important occupation for the early Aryans. Now, what was the status of agriculture? Did early Aryans practice agriculture at all? Yes, they did practice agriculture, but it was underdeveloped, right? So it was subsistence level agriculture, and its relative importance in the economy was quite limited. So it was not the primary economic activity of the Aryans, rather it was the secondary or tertiary economic activity of the Aryans. ठीक है? Most important क्या था? Pastoralism ही था. The Rigved mentions a number of agricultural practices or rituals such as plowing the soil, sowing the crop, harvesting the crop, threshing the crop once it is harvested to remove the grain from the chaff, etc. However, they were not widely practiced. इनका mention तो है, but बहुत infrequent mention है. They are mentioned only in one place. The Aryans had a specific word for all types of food grains. Food grains were referred to by the word yava. राइट. एंड पंजाब और हरियाणा वाले रीजन में विच ग्रेन्स डू यू थिंक वुड हैव बीन द मोस्ट पॉपुलर? अभी भी वहां पे कौन से सबसे ज्यादा पॉपुलर ग्रेन्स हैं? Wheat and barley. So yava was the term that was used interchangeably for wheat and barley. ठीक है. And how did they obtain it? By growing it themselves or largely by trading with the calcolithic groups? Largely by trade. What do you think they offered the calcolithic people in return? Things that they must have abundance of. क्या? Cattle or animal skins, both of domesticated as well as wild animals, or horses, or certain metallic ores that they must be getting access to, right? Or maybe wool, etc. तो इस तरह की चीजें, और milk products, these were the things that they traded. What was the nature of the agricultural surplus that the Aryans themselves created? कोई surplus exist करता था या नहीं? करता रहा होगा तो बहुत छोटा रहा होगा, राइट? सो लिटिल और नो एग्रीकल्चरल surplus existed. As a result, do you think there would have been a high degree of craft specialization? No. Why? Because everybody would have been involved in the search for food sources, either pastoralism or agriculture at a small scale. And therefore, craft specialization was low. ठीक है. Now, despite craft specialization being low, the Rigved does mention certain important secondary economic activities. Or artisanal production, such as pottery, weaving, chariot making, carpentry, metal smithing, basket weaving, goldsmithing, etc. ठीक है. Now, since craft production is taking place at a limited scale, what do you think was the scope of trade? इसका वॉल्यूम और वैल्यू बहुत हाई होता होगा या लिमिटेड होता होगा? लिमिटेड. What was the basis for trade? Did a coinage system exist और barter system पे ट्रेड होता था? barter system पे. Who were the trading partners of the Aryans? Chalcolithic natives as well as other Aryan tribes. What was the balance of trade between Aryans and the Chalcolithic people? ट्रेड किसकी तरफ टिल्टेड रहा होगा? Chalcolithic people की तरफ, right? And that is why they were accused of hoarding wealth. And stealing cattle. Okay. Now, in a pre-agrarian setup, what is the nature of economic differentiation? Does a very highly stratified economic structure exist, or is it relatively flat? इकोनॉमिक क्लासेस में बहुत ज्यादा डिफरेंस होगा या फिर माइनर डिफरेंसेस होंगे? माइनर डिफरेंसेस होंगे. व्हाई? बिकॉज इन द एब्सेंस ऑफ एग्रीकल्चर टेंडेंसी क्या होता है? प्राइवेट ओनरशिप का या कम्युनिटी ओनरशिप का? कम्युनिटी ओनरशिप का. बेसिस फॉर द ऑर्गेनाइजेशन ऑफ द सोसाइटी वाज आल्सो ट्राइबल इन नेचर with limited political and social differentiation. As a result, economic wealth was also fairly widely distributed, right? So the principle of community ownership prevailed, and the Vedic economy was characterized by low wealth inequality. Okay. So these were the features of the early Vedic economy. लिख लें इसको या फिर is this enough? This is enough. Similarly, let us talk about the political life of the early Aryans. What was the nature of the state? Did large territorial kingdoms exist, or was some other arrangement there? किस तरह का state exist करता होगा? The Vedic people were divided into different tribes, right? So therefore, a tribal state system existed. Did the state have a well-defined territorial boundary? Why not? टेरिटरी का कॉन्सेप्ट इमर्ज नहीं हुआ था among the Aryans. Why? Because of their economic roots. What was the mainstay of the economy? Pastoralism. Agriculture had not yet replaced pastoralism as the chief occupation. As a result, the value of land as an economic resource had not emerged or had not been realized. Therefore, conflict over this valuable economic resource had not started. No need was felt by different state entities to demarcate their zone of influence from where they would accumulate all the surplus for themselves. As a result, the concept of territory was non-existent. Okay? Were the Aryans composed of a single tribe or multiple tribes? Multiple tribes, and each tribe would have its own tribal chief, right? And thus, a multi state system existed. What was the nature of the relationship between these different tribal states? कॉन्फ्लिक्ट होता होगा या नहीं? होता था. साथ में cooperation was also there. So relationship between different tribes was characterized by cooperation and frequent conflicts over cattle wealth primarily. ठीक है? What was the basis for political organization? The tribe itself was known as Jan. It represented not only the collection of people who believed that they belonged to the same tribe, but also the highest unit of political organization. It was a synonym for the tribal state, led by a tribal chief known as the Janesya Gopa, right? What was the smallest unit of political organization? Was it the individual or some other entity? Not individual, rather it was the joint family or kul. All political decisions were in the hands of the leader of the household. कौन होता था leader of the household? Eldest male, known as the kulpati. A collection of families inhabited a particular village known as gram, led by the village headman known as the gramini. A collection of villages was known as vis, led by a vispati. ठीक है? Now, what was the nature of kingship or tribal chiefdom? Tribal chief कौन होता था? Janesya Gopa, right? Now, as chiefs or kings become more and more powerful, the roles that they perform, the things that they control, उनमें कमी होती है, इजाफा होता है? इजाफा होता है, बढ़ता है. At this point of time, do you think that the tribal chiefs would have been very powerful? No, they would have relatively little power and their roles would also be limited in nature, right? जनेश गोपा की मेन रिस्पॉन्सिबिलिटीज क्या होती थी? To search for cattle in the wild, right? To struggle or to lead the tribe during cattle raids, right? When members of a particular tribe would raid another tribe or Chalcolithic settlement to loot their cattle. And thirdly, to do what? To defend the tribe against raiders. ठीक है? Was the Janesh Gopa an elected official or was he a hereditary monarch? देखो, at this point of time, पॉलिटिकल ऑर्गेनाइजेशन का जो बेसिस है वो काफी सिंपल है, राइट? सिमिलरली इकोनॉमिक डिफरेंशिएशन बिटवीन द डिफरेंट पीपल दैट इज नॉट वेरी हाई. तो डिस्ट्रीब्यूशन ऑफ वेल्थ is quite well distributed. It is quite well spread across the entire community, right? Therefore, are people not going to be in a position to to make their voice heard when it comes to political matters? या फिर केवल एक बंदे की बात सुनेंगे? एक बंदे की बात नहीं सुनेंगे. Since they have the economic wherewithal, they will have the political power to voice their concerns, to give their views. Therefore, the nature of early Vedic polity was quite democratic in nature. In such a scenario, what are we going to see? The presence of the idea of divine kingship? No. So, divine kingship did not exist. Is the tribal chief going to have very high sounding titles? Is he going to be accompanied by great pomp and show? No. So, royal prestige is going to be limited. Given the democratic nature of the political system and the high level of economic equality, would the tribal chief have been an elected official or a hereditary monarch? Elected official होगा. And the element of royal despotism or absolutism, would it be present? That the king's word is final, there is no challenge to his authority. ये रहा होगा system या उसका उल्टा? उसका उल्टा. The process of decision making was much more democratic. The element of royal absolutism was non-existent. ठीक है? Now, since we have talked about the democratic elements of early Vedic polity, let us expand upon that further. क्या देखने के लिए मिलता है? All the important officials, they were elected and not appointed. Secondly, what do we find? Did these officials have absolute power or did they have limited powers? Limited powers. Meaning that they had significant checks on their authority, exercised by whom? Exercised by the ordinary people through representative bodies or democratic assemblies. Such as the Sabha, the Samiti, the Vidhat, and the Gan or Sangh. This belongs to the later Vedic age. तो ये अर्ली वैदिक एज में नहीं एग्जिस्ट करता था. दिस इमर्ज्ड इन द लेटर वैदिक एज. द अदर थ्री बिलोंग टू द अर्ली वैदिक एज. क्लियर? सभा क्या होता था? इट वाज एन असेंबली ऑफ all the men in the tribe, right? It is all the कुलपतिस. तो सारे men नहीं, कुलपतिस इसमें होते थे, right? Who would represent their families. And what was its purpose? To elect the Janai Sagopa and the other officials. समिति क्या होता था? It was an assembly of elders consisting of both men and women. What was its purpose? To assist the chief in his various responsibilities. So when it came to planning decision making, the tribal chief would convene the samiti, and by either majority voting or by discussion or consultation, decisions would be taken. Vidhat was the oldest of all these assemblies. Okay? It consisted of both men as well as women. And what was its purpose? Primarily, it performed judicial functions. Okay? ये हो गए इसके democratic elements. Now, what do you think was the nature of the state? Highly developed or underdeveloped? Underdeveloped. Nature of the economy क्या था? Primarily pastoral. Status of agriculture क्या था? Less developed, right? तो taxation system के क्या characteristics होंगे? Did any system of taxation exist or not? It existed, but in a very primitive form. Okay? What do we find? It was underdeveloped. In fact, the Rigved mentions only one type of tax over here, that is known as Bali, right? In fact, this was not even a tax, it was a voluntary tribute. Made by the people to their tribal chief. Okay? The word Bali comes from the root word Bal, which means strength. Right? So, इसका justification क्या था for levying Bali or for collecting Bali? That the people owe their loyalty to the chief because he is their chief, because he is the strongest, because he is going to protect them against outsiders. Okay? So it was an expression of sovereignty. All right. Now, without an elaborate and well-developed taxation system in which much of the surplus wealth is being directed towards the state, will the state be able to field a large permanent army? No, क्योंकि उनको पे करना होगा, उनको इक्विप करना होगा, आउटफिट करना होगा, राइट, रसद पहुंचानी होगी, ये सब करना होगा. Therefore, the tradition of permanent standing army was non-existent. But we know that warfare was a chief aspect of life during the early Vedic age. So without an army, who would go to war? Irregular militias, right? That is the males of war going age, males of military age would be organized into raiding parties and defense companies. Tribal militias, raiding parties, and scouts had the military responsibilities or performed the military roles. If there is no taxation, can there be an elaborate bureaucracy? No. Therefore, bureaucracy was also almost entirely non-existent. And whatever few officials were there, what was their nature? Were they appointed by the Janishya Gopa or were they elected? No, they were elected. All the important officials were elected. क्या? During this time? तो उसमें क्या होना? कू होना, COUP. अब देखो वही है ना, that if somebody would perform a coup, it is highly unlikely that the people are going to accept them, right? Why? Because the person that they were overthrowing was the popular choice. Everybody had cast their vote, and if a tribal chief has to be deposed, it would probably have been done through a democratic exercise rather than through a show of strength. So I mean, it was obvious, it may have been possible that a tribal chief may be killed, but once again, whoever emerges as the new tribal chief would first have to gain the confidence of the tribal community as well. So he would have to gain the popular confidence. Only then would his role as the tribal chief would be recognized. Without that, the element of tribal chiefdom would not exist. So ये जो expression of sovereignty है ना, ये sovereignty, it was divided equally between the tribal chief or unequally between the tribal chief and the common people. स्मॉल पोर्शन जो एग्जीक्यूटिव पावर है वो तो ट्राइबल चीफ के पास रहेगा, लेकिन जो उसके पीछे लीगल सैंक्शन है दैट वुड कम फ्रॉम दी पीपल ओनली. ठीक है ना. ब्यूरोक्रेसी वेल डेवलप्ड नहीं था, छोटा था एंड कंसिस्टेड ऑफ इलेक्टेड ऑफिशियल्स. वन इलेक्टेड ऑफिशियल वी ऑलरेडी नो अबाउट द ट्राइबल चीफ, दैट इज द जनेश से गोपा. अपार्ट फ्रॉम दिस टू अदर इंपॉर्टेंट ऑफिशियल्स. कौन कौन? सेनानी. Who was he? The commander chief or the chief of the tribal militia. And the Purohit or the chief priest. Okay? So this was the nature of the tribal polity of the early Vedic age. Now, the nature of क्या हो गया हमारा? इकोनॉमी हो गया, पॉलिटी हो गया, अब क्या बचा है? सोसाइटी, है ना. क्या कैरेक्टरिस्टिक्स देखने के लिए मिलेंगे? Are we going to find sharp social distinctions or an egalitarian social system? क्यों egalitarian social system? Why are we going to see an egalitarian society rather than a highly stratified society? What is the basis of social distinction? Differences in wealth and differences in power. इकोनॉमी में क्या पैटर्न है डिस्ट्रीब्यूशन ऑफ वेल्थ का? इट इज वेल डिस्ट्रीब्यूटेड, फ्लैट सिस्टम है. एंड पावर डिस्ट्रीब्यूशन कैसा है? इज इट हाईली पिरामिडल और इज इट रिलेटिवली फ्लैट? Relatively flat. So even the elites do not have much power, right? This was due to the political and social equality of the early Vedic people. Now, while the society was egalitarian, was there any basis of social ranking at this point of time? Yes, there was. क्या बोलते थे इसको? वर्ना सिस्टम. कितने वर्नास? 4. Initially, only 3 varnas existed. The 4th varna, that is Shudra Varna, emerged towards the end of the early Vedic age. कौन कौन से? ब्राह्मण, क्षत्रिय and वैश्य. Later, 4 varnas emerged. A new one, that is Shudra Varna, was added. What was the basis for the classification of people into these varnas? किस बेसिस पे इनको डिवाइड किया जाता था? Was the basis purely social or was it economic or political in nature? Economic differentiation पे बेस्ड था. The four varnas represented different occupational groups. Right? Presently, is it possible for people to change the varna that they are born into? नहीं होता है. Back then, it was possible. ठीक है? So varna was not assigned by birth. Rather, it was achieved by individuals on the basis of their merit, their capabilities. Varna was an attained status and not an ascribed or assigned one. Right? Further, since it was possible for people to change their varna mobility also existed. In fact, there were also no restrictions on varna intermarriage. It was perfectly acceptable for people of different varnas to be married to each other. ठीक है? Now, क्या? हाँ, it was applied because women also used to participate in economic activities, na? Nahi, in fact, there is a hymn in the Rigved which says that my mother is a basket weaver, my father is a chariot maker, and I am a scholar. My brother, he is a hunter and a warrior. इस तरह से कुछ description है. That means people of the same family could possibly belong to different varnas. It was perfectly ordinary at that point of time. तो ऐसा नहीं होता था कि women का अलग कोई varna नहीं होता था. They may have a different varna than their मेल काउंटरपार्ट्स. ठीक है? नाउ वरना तो एग्जिस्ट करता था, बट डिड द सिस्टम ऑफ कास्ट और जाति एग्जिस्ट? नो, इट वाज एब्सेंट. व्हाई? व्हाट इज द बेसिस फॉर द इमर्जेंस ऑफ कास्ट? The proliferation of production crafts or proliferation of craft groups, right? So as many craft groups emerge within the society, it would become more and more difficult to hierarchically arrange them within the fourfold varna system. That is why the different occupations are going to be assigned a particular caste status. For example, there would be a particular caste of people who are responsible for maintaining written records, or there is a different caste of people who are responsible for collecting revenue, or there is a different caste of people who are responsible for manufacturing pots, a different caste of blacksmiths, a different caste of leather tanners, etc. Right? So, क्योंकि at this point of time, the number of crafts being practiced by specialized groups was almost unheard of. Therefore, caste की जरूरत पड़ी ही नहीं. So, reason क्या है इसका? There was not sufficient economic differentiation. And what is the general purpose of caste? To increase differentiation or to decrease differentiation? Increase differentiation, increase the distance between the upper and the lower, right? And what was the basic nature of the Varna society, of the Vedic society? Egalitarian or hierarchical? Egalitarian. Therefore कास्ट के लिए कोई आइडियोलॉजिकल जस्टिफिकेशन, आइडियोलॉजिकल नीड भी नहीं फील हुआ उस समय, राइट? सो was not needed in the context of the flexible and mobile, or flexible and egalitarian early Vedic society. ठीक है? Did the practice of untouchability exist or not? होता था या नहीं? नहीं होता था. The basis of untouchability was caste-based distinction, and since caste itself had not emerged, therefore untouchability was also absent. When would it finally emerge? In the post-Mauryan and Gupta period, when the proliferation of crafts led to the emergence of different jatis and subcastes, right? And the idea of pollution of the varnas became a main concern for the people who were writing the text, the important law books of that period. In order to prevent that from happening, they assigned certain castes to be untouchables. और क्या बोला कि वरना इंटरमैरिजेस की रिजल्ट से बंदा ऑटोमेटिकली इस अनटचेबल कैटेगरी में पहुंच जाएगा, राइट? Now, since economic differentiation, social differentiation, and the presence of castes or the emergence of castes had not taken place to a sufficient degree in the early Vedic age, therefore untouchability did not exist. It would finally emerged much later, that is during the post-Mauryan and Gupta age. Okay. Now, does this mean that there was no social discrimination in the early Vedic society? Were any groups of people discriminated against or not? होते थे. कौन थे? The non-Aryans, that is the Dasas, Dasyus and Panis. So, social discrimination took place on the basis of race or skin color. It took the shape of enslavement of the discriminated people and the circulation of negative stereotypes against them. ठीक है? The discriminated groups included Dasas, Dasyus or Panis, right? while the Aryans were fair-skinned, Dasas, Dasyus, and Panis were relatively having darker skin. ठीक है? But among the Aryans, was there any social discrimination? नहीं होता था, right? Social discrimination among Aryans was non-existent. And reason क्या है इसका? The basis for social organization was tribe, right? And what connects people belonging to the same tribe, different people belonging to the same tribe? Either having a common ancestor or believing that they have a common ancestor, right? So the reason for this was their tribal identity. Based on common lineage or kinship ties. So in reality or in their imagination, the Aryans of a particular tribe believe that they are all related to each other through a common ancestor. And in such a scenario, the simple act of being born into a certain tribe would give all the members of that tribe the same set of rights, duties, as well as obligations. Political power, economic power, and social power, or political rights, economic rights, and social rights, उसके ऊपर unequal control नहीं होगा. Since all these people belong to the same group, therefore these things are going to be divided equally. Membership in the tribe resulted in the automatic, you can say, acquisition of common rights, privileges, duties, and obligations. In every field. That is, when it comes to political rights, economic rights, religious access and ability, and society as well. Okay? That is why within the tribes there was no social discrimination. Or among Aryans, there was no or little social discrimination. Okay? In fact, this argument can also be used to explain the relatively little differentiation on the basis of polity and economy. क्योंकि सब लोग एक ही पार्ट, एक ही फैमिली के एक्सटेंडेड मेंबर्स और एक ही एक्सटेंडेड फैमिली के मेंबर्स कंसिडर किए जाते थे. दैट इज व्हाई देयर वाज नो नीड टू डिफरेंशिएट बिटवीन द पीपल. Then what was the condition of women like? There is one particular group of scholars that claims that the early Vedic age was a golden age for women. Who do you think was putting forward such ideas? Which group of historians? Nationalist historians. So this was a nationalist interpretation. Why do you think that they were giving this interpretation? Because they wanted to glorify the early Vedic age as an ideal period where women enjoyed respectability within society. They wanted to answer the negative propaganda being put forward by the colonial historians that India is a barbaric nation and its culture has always served women very negatively or treated women very poorly. They wanted to show that India in the early Vedic age was a very progressive society, or the Indian society was a very progressive society. So it was partly a response to negative colonial propaganda. Further, the colonial historians were saying that since India has historically treated its women extremely poorly, therefore it is necessary for the British to remain in India and rule Indians. Why? Because British are protecting Indian women. So in order to protect Indian women, the presence of the British is necessary. So nationalists wanted to show that this was not the case. Indians knew how to treat women properly, right? So that is another factor. Further, they wanted to infuse a sense of pride among Indians in order to increase the increase the feeling of patriotism, especially among the educated youth. The educated youth was being trained in a very negative manner by the colonial historians. It was being trained to hate the ancient past and Indian culture, to hate the Indian civilization. This had to be corrected. So, in order to invoke a sense of patriotism, they put forward these ideas. The nationalist historians were also supported by another group of intellectuals who were quite prominent in the 19th century. Con, the 19th century social reformers. They also claimed that the early Vedic age was a golden age for women. What was their main objective? To carry out significant social reforms. And many of these social reforms were meant to emancipate women, right? So it was necessary to claim that the early Vedic age, which was the root of the Hindu civilization, was a golden age, right? It was the ideal situation and it was an ideal that modern Indians should return to. That the practices or the evils present in 19th century society were unheard of in the early Vedic age. These are later additions or later corruptions that have crept into the practice of Indian religion and within Indian society. So their agenda was to fulfill the social necessity or necessity of reform. Okay. Now, obviously, both these groups made common cause. Same subject में interested है. Therefore, both of them studied the same things. Here. Now, if they are claiming that it was a golden age, they must have presented certain evidence. Right? किस तरह का एविडेंस प्रेजेंट किया है इन्होंने? फर्स्ट ऑफ ऑल, that the Rigved mentions a large number of female gods or goddesses, indicating that the early Aryans had no problem in visualizing the divine in the female form. This means that there must have been a great degree of respect for women. Okay. Further, women also had access to education. In fact, there is mention in the Rig Veda of a particular category of female scholars known as Brahmavadinis. Who were these female scholars? They composed certain hymns of the Rig Veda. Okay? They included scholars such as Ghosa, Apala, Sikta, Vishwavara, Maitri, etc. Right? Then they argued that women were not subjected to any religious disabilities. They could perform the yagyas, participate in the yagyas without any discrimination. Religious abilities, according to them, were not imposed on women. Similarly, women also participated openly in political activities. Right? कैसे पता लगता है? They participated in democratic assemblies such as the Samiti and Vidhat. They aided the Janesya Gopa in making important decisions. They performed important judicial functions as well, right? So political participation bhi inka hota tha. Then there was no restriction on the economic participation of women. In fact, there were certain occupations which were performed exclusively by women, such as weaving or basket making or milking of cows or gathering of food produce, etc. Right? Further, modern social evils such as, let's say, sati or child marriage or parda or dowry, etc., none of them existed in the early Vedic age. Women enjoyed a great degree of freedom, which was reflected in their free choice, especially with regards to their partners, their marriage partners. तो अरेंज मैरिजेस होती तो थी, बट नॉर्मल ट्रेंड क्या होता था? स्वयंवर का. Meaning, women were free to choose their husbands without any fear or prejudice, right? एक बार शादी हो गई है, but husband turns out to be abusive. So, if women do not have a choice to end the marriage, then condition of women becomes extremely poor. They become helpless. But यहाँ पे क्या देखने के लिए मिलता है? Dissolution of marriage was possible upon fulfillment of certain conditions. ठीक है. Further, unlike later periods when the birth of a girl child was considered to be a burden, यहाँ पे कोई ऐसा prejudice था? नहीं था. So there was no taboo against the birth of a girl child. Female infanticide ये सब होता था? None of these things took place. ठीक है. On the basis of this, nationalist historians have claimed that early Vedic age was a golden age for women. However, this perspective has some significant limitations. किस तरह के limitations? That yes, while it is true that female goddesses existed, but who was more important, male gods or female gods? Male gods were much more important. And not only that, they were depicted to be much more powerful as well. For example, there is a particular hymn in the Rig Veda in which Indra is riding his chariot along a river, and he is being pursued by Yami, the daughter of Yam, who is trying to seduce him. Right? Indra gets annoyed, simply fires a bow from his arrow and shatters the wheel of Yami's chariot, thus leaving her behind. तो क्या दिखा रहा है? That Indra was much more powerful than Yami, right? Further, although there was no restriction on women when it came to receiving education, and some Brahmavadinis also composed hymns of the Rig Veda, the majority of composers of the hymns of the Rig Veda, male or female? Male. Further, while there were no religious disabilities against women, that means women had the right to participate in religious rituals, etc., could they do this on their own? No, they would always do this in the presence of their male relatives, never on their own. On the other hand, men के ऊपर भी ऐसा कोई restriction था? नहीं था. Men could perform various sacrifices or yagyas either alone or with their wives. ठीक है? So, role of women in religious practices was secondary to men. It was not they did not have the primary role. Further, when it comes to the priests, were there any female priests? कोई नहीं होती थी. All the priests were males. While they participated in the democratic assemblies and took part in the decision-making process, could they ever be elected as the Janesi Gopa or the important officials? No. So they could not hold political office. While women did participate in economic activities, who used to take all the important decisions with regards to the output of that economic activity? कि उसको कहाँ पे इन्वेस्ट करना चाहिए, उसको कैसे यूज करना चाहिए? It was the male, the eldest member of the eldest male of the family, the Kulpati. So economic planning and decision making was controlled exclusively by men. ठीक है? While the dissolution of marriage was possible, there were several conditions that needed to be fulfilled first. ऐसा नहीं होगा कि डिवोर्स मांगा तो मिल ही जाएगा. So dissolution of marriage was conditional in nature, right? And while the early Aryans did not consider the birth of a girl child to be a burden, प्रे किसके लिए करते थे? दोनों के लिए? only males? Only males. There was a clear male child preference. They prayed for the birth of sons. ठीक है? नेक्स्ट कितने एस्पेक्ट्स हुए? 5. मैरिज 5th था, 6th. वुमेन 6th था, तो मैरिज 7th. What was the nature of the institution of marriage? Was it a legal contract or was it considered to be a sacred bond? Sacred bond. So it was a sacrament. और इस तरह के Holy bonds, are they destructible or indestructible? Indestructible, but under certain conditions, marriages were dissoluble. Namely, if the husband or wife is suffering from an incurable disease, or if he has been absent for an extended period of time, पता नहीं है, भाग गया है, right? Or if either partner is suffering from infertility, cannot have children. In such cases, marriages may be dissolved. ठीक है? Were there any barriers on whom people could marry? No. So, Varna intermarriage was acceptable. How many spouses were allowed? Any number of spouses. So, both monogamy and polygamy were practiced. ज्यादा क्या होता होगा? Monogamy was the norm. Most ordinary people performed monogamy. They had one spouse. While polygamy was limited largely to the elites. And ऋग्वेद कंपोज किसने किया होगा? कॉमनर्स ने या एलिट्स ने? एलिट्स ने. That is why we get very frequent mention of polygamy, which creates the impression that this rather than monogamy must have been the normal practice. However, monogamy was definitely the norm at this point of time. Now, within polygamy, दो तरह से हो सकता है. एक द्रौपदी स्टाइल, उसको क्या बोलते हैं? पॉलीएंड्री. दूसरा धर्मेंद्र स्टाइल, उसको क्या बोलते हैं? पॉलीजिनी. राइट? पॉलीएंड्री मीन्स one woman, multiple husbands, and polygyny is one man, multiple wives. ठीक है? द्रौपदी स्टाइल एंड धर्मेंद्र स्टाइल. बताओ ज्यादा कॉमन क्या होता होगा? Polygyny was more common. It was the norm, while polyandry was the exception. But was polyandry prohibited in any way? It was not prohibited. ठीक है? But there were no legal restrictions against it. Although it was the exception, there were no legal restrictions against it. Were widows forced to commit sati? No. Were they ostracized and excluded from the society, driven out? No. SMA, were they allowed to remarry or not? Yes. Widows were not considered inauspicious. And they were allowed to remarry. And widow remarriage में common practice क्या होता था? That they were usually married off to the younger brother of their husbands. This practice is known as the practice of levirate. ठीक है? फर्दर एक यूनिक प्रैक्टिस देखने के लिए मिलता है, दैट इज नियोग. Right? Now, suppose a husband is unable to fulfill his procreation related responsibilities. He is suffering from infertility or has to remain away, but the husband and wife want a child. Then, in that case, the husband can allow the wife to have sexual relations with another man whom the husband chooses. ठीक है? And then जो भी उनका issue होगा, the child that the woman has is considered to be the child of the husband and the wife, not the third person. Right? So write down niyog. Husbands suffering from infertility or those who are unable to produce children for other reasons could sanction sexual relations between their wives and another man of their choice. ठीक है? This was the institution of marriage. Then some other aspects of social life, such as the institution of gotra. Was it present during the early Vedic age? नहीं होता था. It was absent. Ashram, that is the division of the life of an individual into distinct stages. Was this present? It was also absent. Both these institutions emerged later during the later Vedic age. ठीक है? Now, take down a couple of questions. The early Vedic age was a golden age for women. critically analyze. $15 marks. Next question. Highlight the important characteristics of the early Vedic economy. Full stop. How did it shape the political structure and social system of the early Vedic age? $15 marks. Third question. Examine the significance of the arrival of the Portuguese in India. $15 marks or 200 words. Now, ये जो दो questions हैं, questions number 2 and 3, these are part of a new weekly exercise that we are starting. You have 2 or 3 days to write the answers of these questions and submit them. And Sunday को 8 बजे both Nikhil sir and we are going to have a Zoom session in which we are going to discuss the strategy and approach to address both these questions, right? Now for this exercise, not only are students of the current batch invited, but all students who are appearing in the UPSC examination, जो हमसे पढ़े हुए हैं, all of them can participate. तो अभी क्या बोलते हैं, जो common group है हिस्ट्री ऑप्शनल का, वहां पे भी ये क्वेश्चंस भेज दिए गए हैं. संडे को शाम 8 बजे को इनके सॉल्यूशंस डिस्कस होंगे. ठीक है, ऑल राइट देन, हो जाएंगे क्वेश्चंस. ठीक है, सो दैट इज इट फॉर टुडे. अगर कोई डाउट्स ना हो, कल मिलते हैं. पहले अर्ली वैदिक एज का रिलीजन एड्रेस करेंगे, फिर उसके बाद लेटर वैदिक एज पे पहुंचेंगे. ठीक है, वी आर गोइंग टू सी दी चेंजेस दैट टेक प्लेस.